Tatsmewi oi kaloma, liloitza. Tats pain. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's good that you came here. Wenakisa Beth Piatot. My name is Beth Piatot, and I'm the director of the Arts Research Center. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's artist talk with the internationally renowned Chemehuevi photographer, Cara Romero. This event is co-sponsored by the Departments of Art Practice, Ethnic Studies, the History of Art, and the Center for Interdisciplinary Critical Inquiry and the Center for Race and Gender. Before I hand the mic over to our host today, Professor Greg Levine, I want to say a word about land acknowledgements. We are meeting today on the unceded territory of the Ohlone people, who have been in this place forever and will continue to be here forever. But land acknowledgements without action, without commitments of material and other resources, are empty. The Arts Research Center is taking action through material support of Indigenous arts and languages in our programming. We urge each person in this room to find a way to offer resources of time, money, and energy to support Ohlone people and other Indigenous people in their self-determined efforts for political, linguistic, and artistic autonomy. I encourage you to take some of our gorgeous event cards featuring Cara Romero's work to brighten up your office, your dorm room, any place you can find to remember this beautiful day and this beautiful work of this amazing photographer with us. You'll see that on one of the cards we have our events for the term. If you missed any of them, you can check out the recordings on our website, and this event too will be recorded, so you can share it with friends and watch it again. So I'll now invite Professor Greg Levine to the stage to introduce Cara Romero and her conversation partner, Talia Dixon.
Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome. I'm Greg Levine of the Department of History of Art, and it's simply tremendous that Cara is here. Visiting the campus, but also here this morning to share her work as a fine arts photographer. This is truly an outstanding part of the Art Research Center's programming, which Beth was just speaking of. Cara's talk will be followed by a conversation that will start up here with Cara herself, of course, and also Talia Dixon, enrolled member of the Palma Band of the Senyo Indians and graduate student in theater, dance, and performance studies. But then the conversation will widen out to all of us in the room, and there will be a handheld mic for you to be heard. And so raise your hand, would you like to speak? And you'll get the mic passed to you. Well known to many of us in the arts and Native American and Indigenous studies, Cara's photography is at first glance elegantly immersive. But look again. And it's difficult not to look again. And the exquisite force of her visual narratives draws us into grounded, watery, and embodied spaces where Indigenous homeland, lived experience, settler colonialism, and the technologies of modernity and climate crisis converge, sometimes in the seemingly surreal. Her images are inclusive to us as viewers, as allies, as neighbors, but they leave no doubt as to the everyday world ways and political visioning of Indigenous peoples. And in addition to her work as a photographer, Cara has served as the executive director of the Chemehuevi Cultural Center, a member of the Tribal Council, chair of the Chemehuevi Education Board and Head Start Policy Council. And her visit to campus comes on the heels of the remarkable Bioneers Conference last week, for which she serves as the program director for the Bioneers Indigeneity Program. So please offer your warm welcome to Cara Romero.
Maiquis, nuk Cara Romero niega, nuk nu tau kuivanius. I am Cara Romero. I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you for coming out. I'll get right into a little autobiography and then into the work. I was born to interracial parents in the Los Angeles area in 1977. And in 1979, our entire family, mother, father, brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles, relocated to the Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation, which is on the furthest edge of San Bernardino County, right on the border of Arizona. It's 41 miles of waterfront on Havasu Lake, the Colorado River, so deep in the heart of the Mojave Desert. We are in a landscape. It is the second most biodiverse ecosystem behind the rainforests, the Mojave Desert, full of cactus and Joshua trees and desert patina, and then of course this cradle of life, the Colorado River flowing through the middle of it. It is the hottest place in the United States outside of Death Valley, so we have 30 days every summer. That's over 120 degrees in July and August. Most Chemehuevi artifacts in museums and the art practice that we're known for is basket weaving. We're known as the greatest of the Great Basin basket weavers, weaving with willow and devil's claw predominantly, but sharing intertribally with tribes nearby. And so you'll see also juncus and yucca root in our baskets. We were flooded out of our ancestral valley, one of our ancestral valleys, with the damming of the Colorado River to make Lake Havasu. And underneath Lake Havasu are homesteads and cemeteries, but also all of our riparian wetlands. So all of our cottonwoods and our willows that we gathered with, all of our natural agricultural floodplains are underneath the lake. And so there was a time of great sadness, right? When the tribe dispersed to Las Vegas, to Los Angeles, to Phoenix, to Parker, Arizona, and they could no longer live in Chemehuevi Valley. The tribe reorganized after what's known as termination in the United States in the 60s and 70s. We gained our federal recognition in 1970, which is what came right before our family moved from the Los Angeles area back to the reservation. At that point, my grandmother was chairwoman growing up. I was, about 2 years old, and it's a place where we fished all day long. We swam all day long. We rode in the back of pickup trucks. There were only about 30 homes on, a one-road town, and it was a very super rural way of growing up, 70 miles one way to the grocery store. So we all ate together every day, and it was, family was everything. In the 80s, my parents split. My mom's family had relocated from California to Houston, Texas, and I ended up smack dab in a majority minority school district in Houston, Texas, which is all of the cultural shock that you can imagine coming from the reservation. And I learned pretty quick, starting in elementary school, that there was a major misunderstanding of how academia portrayed Native American history, Native American people. I have memories of, Thanksgiving where they pulled out the oatmeal packages, and the kids would start banging around on the drums, and everybody would put on construction paper, feathered headdresses. And I remember the humiliation. And that's, a very common story, racism that Native Americans face in school, just based on erasure and misunderstanding, kind of like the final steps of genocide. And I think it instilled in me from a very young age that I knew that there was a difference between this absence that I was experiencing off the reservation and this deep lived experience, this presence of beautiful people, beautiful photographs of family members. And this is true. We all have been, Native American people have often been living in kind of a parallel universe within dominant culture, but thriving, surviving, ideas of resilience, whether it be in the cities or on reservations, facing unspeakable odds really for, how to live and how to be and how to keep culture together, but nonetheless very beautiful and very diverse. And so I wanted to tell this story. And in undergrad, I started out in cultural anthropology at the University of Houston. And I thought that this was really my only route to be able to get into Native studies, to be able to change the narrative for contemporary Native peoples, to write the textbook that I never had growing up that included all of the incredible stories and the history and the damming of the rivers and all the things that were missing. And I stumbled into a black and white photography class in 1998 that changed my life. It was in my senior block at the University of Houston. And I had a professor that was more interested in content over technical ability. His name was Bill Thomas. And I had never picked up a camera before. I had to borrow a camera in order to be able to take the course. It was a black and white film course. And everybody was way technologically, more advanced. They had been in the dark rooms. They came from, families of wealth that had these fancy cameras. And I didn't really even know how to use it. So he would give us these assignments like, take a panoramic with content. And everybody was mastering like the print side of the process, the exposure. And me, I was like really, really struggling, but I would nail it every time. I had this ability to put narrative into a photograph. And that for me opened my mind up to kind of think about that old adage that like a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And I felt like it was this visual form of communication that I could build into these narratives and content and be able to do that thing that I always wanted to do, which was to teach, which was to give other Native people a glimpse into our own lives of what we know to be true, and then to teach cross-culturally that, all the preconceived notions that you've learned thus far might need to be checked at the door. And so I did what 21-year-olds do, and I ran off to the Institute of American Indian Arts to go to art school. This was a tremendous experience. I showed up after my undergrad at the University of Houston. Tribal colleges are incredibly important in the United States. It is a place where Native Americans can come from all over, and often from isolated communities, and meet each other and talk to each other. And so it kind of becomes this haven for ideas to relate struggles with each other, to learn together. And where often schools have these retention problems for Native students, tribal colleges do not, right? Because we kind of understand all of the nuances and challenges for what it is to be a Native American, whether you're in an urban setting or a rural reservation setting, to come together. And so when I came here, I think often when you're starting out in art, you're emulating what's out there, right? And so I was at this tribal college to become a Native American photographer. And really there was not very much reference out there for what that meant. And there was Edward Curtis, and there were all of the ethnographic photographers from the turn of the century that were documenting the vanishing race. And they were beautiful portraits, sometimes stage portraits of Native people at the turn of the century, dressed in their regalia, lit beautifully. And so I began to emulate Curtis. We all were in the dark room. We were asking our friends to dress up in their regalia, to go out into a landscape devoid of any modern context. And there was just these moments where they were very beautiful, but I think I was very disillusioned with where I was going with the art, because while the photographs are very beautiful and capture the imagination like the Edward Curtis photos, we don't even do this, right? This is a ask of my brother to go put on his regalia and make sure that we're in a nook of an adobe devoid of modern context. And so that was kind of the first, artists have a lot of existential crises throughout their lives. And this was just one of them, of, photography can be a weapon. against Native peoples. And so how do you look at this medium and not use it to perpetuate stereotypes, to exploit your own community? And so that was a big question that I had to unpack for myself, is to say, you know, we don't even do this. Why are we doing this as young Native photographers? Because we're perpetuating a style of photography that came from outside of the culture. And that's really true of, you know, this is a young time, like, do I want to be a National Geographic photographer? You know, those answers are kind of all wrapped up in the same ideas of exploitation, right? Do the communities that are being photographed that end up in National Geographic, is that doing anything for their community? And for me, the answer was no. You know, they were they were coming from an outside stance. And so I'm going to get into the body of work that I became known for. And I pressed on and I continued to mature as a photographer and learn about myself. And so I've categorized the slides in the show really around emerging themes after the fact. And so there's not, you know, quite in chronological order, but more of like, okay, I've done this and this is where I see it fitting for the slideshow. So they're categorized first by this idea of cultural landscape as Native peoples. As all peoples, we really feel that there is a place where our bodies are from, where our DNA emerges, where our language emerges from a particular landscape, where our bones are from, right? And this is the Mojave Desert for me. This is a place where we're inseparable from the landscape, which is, you know, kind of why you see First Peoples on the front lines of these environmental fights, putting their bodies on the line, trying to protect against environmental degradation, protecting the waterways. It's really these deep ties to the landscape. This piece is called Jackrabbit and Cottontail, and it is an autobiographical piece. It is a mixed-race woman with her 2 Native children out in the landscape. It blends time and space. The children are dressed pre-colonial. This is our reservation, the shoreline of Lake Havasu, and it's colored to look like bad film, like film from the 70s that I grew up with that were, you know, taken with brownie cameras and, you know, thrown in a shoebox. It kind of evokes all of that feeling of being where I'm from. It has a little bit of modern context, but this idea that we're as indigenous as we ever were in these modern times, and bringing these ideas of Jackrabbit and Cottontail. They are our warrior twins in Chemehuevi, and in our mythos and creation stories, they make the earth habitable for the first humans. And so that's what this photograph is about. We have sense of humor, right? This is a little bit more about the landscape that we're from. This is my dad's Cadillac in my dad's backyard with 4 of, they're 2 sets of brothers, and you'll see them appear in my photographs. We're just all from the same place. I grew up about 10 or 15 years older than their parents, and know their grandparents and their great-grandparents, which is a common way of being on the reservation. This idea of women having a special ability to commune with the landscape is a part of our worldview in Chemehuevi. All of the landscape was made from the body of our creator, who was a woman. And so she stretched her body and sent the animals to the edges of her body to tell her when she was big enough, wrapped around the ocean, big enough. And this is sand and stone, the landscape that I'm from. In Southern California, we're bird singers. This is a silhouette that was taken from one hilltop to the next hilltop with a long lens, like a 200 millimeter lens. And so it's simply a silhouette of 4 boys bird singing, which begins right as the sun goes down on the other side of the horizon. And more sense of humor. This is a pop cultural reference to Abbey Road, but this is the long 17-mile road that goes into our reservation. And so a little glimpse into what you might see in the ancestral homelands of Chemehuevi. So this idea of environment and indigenous response really kind of still pulls on this idea of storytelling for me, that idea from the very beginning of wanting to explain how we ended up how we live today, right? And so when we're not learning indigenous stories or Native American stories alongside of American history, it makes the disconnect between modern lived life even more misunderstood. And now we're facing dealing with the effects of climate change in disproportionate ways. We're still very much living in subsistence, very close to our landscapes, often in pristine, undeveloped areas, stewarding the land with a very different mindset than people that are in urban epicenters. And we have difficulty expressing and having the voice to help people understand why our pristine environments are so important. We continue to face battles like Standing Rock. Standing Rock is everywhere. You know, we are literally on every reservation in the United States battling environmental degradation, whether it be resource extraction, pollution of waters in the Mojave Desert is the biggest land grab going on right now. It's a history that repeats itself and repeats itself. This next piece was really inspired initially by multiple things, right? And that's how some of these ideas are conceived of. You don't really know exactly where inspiration is going to come from. But for me, for this one, I like to explain it because it's probably very different than the story people absorb just from bringing their own experience to it. I was talking to my friend Ariel Deranger, who's from the Fort Chipewyan up by the Alberta tar sands, which is a horrific open mining of the tar sands, causing sickness with their tribe adjacent, their waters. And she was also talking about how their land bridges had melted. And I was visiting Canada at the time, and I was in Vancouver under this overpass in a botanical garden, and all of the columns, the pillars, were painted with these striations of blue going up the columns. And I asked the tour guide, what is this representing? And he said, this is what it looks like when the sea levels rise in this particular area. And so it was this moment of catastrophic fantasy of seeing what the flood would look like in this particular area that we were in. And the idea stayed with me. And oftentimes if an idea stays with me and kind of haunts me, I'll know like this is something that I'm supposed to pursue and make. I began to think about these floating figures underwater in my mind's eye. And I began to think also about the flooding back home. There are stories of still 2 inches of water being on the floor of the homesteads and the Army Corps of Engineers having to drag people out. This was only the 1930s, less than 100 years ago. You know, these are still stories that we talk about on a regular basis. You can still see the treetops from a sporting boat on top of the lake. And the waters are, you know, haunted. And I began to talk to so many friends in Santa Fe. It's this big, wonderful intertribal community. And this story of being flooded out of your homelands is not uncommon, right? They made Lake Sacagawea, Lake Mead, Lake Powell. It goes on and on and on. The Indian tribes whose lands were declared eminent domain, and they flooded them out. And then simultaneously, presently, they're experiencing flooding. They're experiencing flooding in Houma Nation in Louisiana, and they're having to move up in Alaska, having to move away from the shorelines. And these two particular friends of mine were experiencing flooding from the effects of the Las Conchas wildfires in northern New Mexico. Their village was flooding where it had not flooded before. So that's where these pieces, that was where the conception of these pieces came from. Water memory was an incredible learning experience for me because it became much more than that to the viewer. And that is just an important part of art, that really when you're working with the subconscious, you begin to work with the collective conscious, and you can make works that resonate very deeply with people in ways that you may not have intended. This piece is probably my most famous piece, if you will. It ended up in the Met. It's in many prestigious collections, and I think that while I enjoy explaining it to you all where it came from, I like to really let people have their own experience with this piece, because it's really a powerful relationship we have as humans with water. So this piece was Chinupa Hanska Lugar. He is another incredible artist that lives there in the Santa Fe area, and his tribe, like mine, were flooded out of their ancestral homelands. They ended up on a chunk of clay, and they found oil, right? And so people wonder, like, how can Fort Berthold be living on an oil economy, you know? And it's really a story of survivance. You know, they were forced into having no other hand to play in order to feed their children, to have economy. And so, like I was saying, without these stories, we have a greater misunderstanding. This piece is called Evolvers. These appeared on billboards as part of the 2019 Biennale, Desert X in Coachella Valley. I did a billboard takeover, and the idea was an indigenous response to the landscape. I take that back. The Desert X invites 25 international artists to make land-based art installation in response to the landscape. I was the only Native person from the California desert that had ever been asked to participate in the Desert X Biennale. And so I took the time to create pieces that spoke to this idea of infrastructure coming into our landscapes, and these stories that are told throughout the United States of these are going into empty landscapes. These are where nobody lives. But here again, you know, these are incredibly biodiverse spaces with a long arc of indigenous history. The washes of the desert are the tide pools of the desert. And so how they get through these environmental assessments and you know, the national environmental NEPA laws, I have no idea. But they do, and they come in. And so we're at this, you know, great threshold. I named it Evolvers because we do embrace this idea of renewable energy and of a world living on solar energy. But right now, we're experiencing the largest land grab in US history of pristine biodiverse landscape in the Mojave Desert. So if we keep doing it the same with big corporate energy, it will still go into the backyards of people of color who will suffer, and we will, you know, have environmental repercussions. This was meant to look like a sci-fi poster, like they're running away from Godzilla. They're the four brothers from my reservation, and it was a candid shot. We would set them back into the wash, and we'd say, okay, on your mark, get set, go. And so they're just like running and having so much fun. And I have a strobe light off camera that captures them in motion this way. This was, of course, at the same time when they were proposing the violent wall at the southern border. And so I did take a moment to be in an advertising space and advertise love for our brothers and sisters to the south. Coachella is home to one of the largest migrant farm working populations in the United States. And so this was the only one that I got a little kickback from, but enjoyed it nonetheless. And here again, a protector of a sacred site in Indian Canyon, which is an incredibly important space to the Agua Caliente band of Cahuilla Indians, but to all peoples of Southern California. This is a sacred site. On to a project that I did in 2020 for the Indian Collective. I was part of their Radical Imagination grant. It was to make more public art in the Los Angeles area, bringing visibility to First Peoples being in a big urban epicenter, kind of like the Bay Area. And so we really took the time to interview and talk story, intertribally with each other about some of the things that tribes face along the coast. And I think if I could impart one thing to, young people growing up in an urban epicenter in America is that these places are vibrating with energy, and even though they're completely concreted over, they were holy places for the First Peoples. These are the places where the most decimation happened of First Peoples. The most genocide happened in the cities because they were full of, I hate the word resources, but you know what I'm getting at. These were the places that were full of resources, of ports. There were Indians here, traversing the bay in all of the different directions, and, had a trade, like a very sophisticated trade and economy here in the Bay. And the same is true of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a holy place to the people of Southern California. For our tribes all the way out in the desert, Los Angeles is the place where you can see the spirit, right, coming off of the waters. That's the spirit of Great Ocean Woman, Los Angeles, named after the angels, right, that you can see coming off the water. And so I wanted to tell stories about how Los Angeles is still a holy place. I also wanted to tell the story that's erased from a lot of American history. The waves of colonial violence in California were some of the worst in the United States. And the grand finale was with the 49ers and, the great American genocide that happened between about 1847 and 1867. Don't quote me on that. Don't test them on that. But right around that area, people coming over, it was sick, right? And so tribes retreated, tribes hid, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans died. Up into the turn of the century. And it was no mistake that these places were rich in gold and oil. And yet still there are descendants that have stories, that have culture all along the coast. There are 19 tribes that never received their federal recognition in places like San Francisco, San Luis Obispo, Monterey, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Juan Capistrano. There are peoples that still exist today that went through these horrific waves of genocide. And so this is a Tongva woman from Los Angeles, a tribe that you don't often get to get a glimpse, but of course they're Pacific peoples. They gathered shellfish, they fished, and this is a story kind of Washoyo, who is an incredible artist in her own right, and she wanted to have a remembrance story of her grandfather as an abalone diver. And this is my daughter. It was taken during the same set of photographs, but she is a dancer, and she is wearing a contemporary ballet costume made in all of the ancestral techniques of the coast of California. So her bodice has thousands of feathers sewn onto it by one of the most celebrated regalia makers, Liamata Frawa, from the Chumash area, from San Luis Obispo. Okay, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about decolonizing self-image through matriarchy. I'm really known for women taking a strong central role in my photographs. I think it comes from, Chemehuevi creator being a woman, my grandma being a chairwoman. I grew up in a small community, but we had a great amount of gender equity, if you will. Young Chemehuevi women are taught that they're every bit as strong, that we're allowed to speak up, to take up space. Our tribal council is often equally men and women, and sometimes dominated by women. No, we don't count, but I think that is a space that is unique, because when I left the reservation, it was not that way. And I think another reason why it's so important to give the strength and humanity to Native women through photography is really when you've been dehumanized as a people is really where it creates this doorway or gateway for many of the epidemics that we face. So representation or negative or dehumanized representation is directly correlated with things like high suicide rates, alcoholism, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So it's something to think about, like when you wonder, why is that mascot racist? When you humiliate young people and you dehumanize them, it has a devastating effect on their self-esteem, the way they grow up, the way that they present in the world, right? And so this is my daughter, Cricket. This was taken just at the edge of her making her transition into womanhood. It was kind of a fleeting moment. I remember I told her to lean forward and look fierce. This one is Ka. It is a story of how the mythos of clay woman is passed down to her through thousands of years. Ka is a contemporary clay artist, and she has a second image of ancestral Puebloan pot overlaid onto her skin. This one is Nikki. She is Dene, and she is she's posed in front of an antique Dene blanket, really evoking a birthing stance. And this is Pishon. She comes from a family of ledger artists. This series, First American Girls, we constructed doll boxes to take ownership of our representation in pop culture. And there's kind of a longer story, but I want to keep it short and keep on time so that we can get to our conversation. It was really a paucity of seeing anything for my daughter. Right at that age, all that there were the American Girl dolls. There was one Native American. We don't have one story as Native Americans. We have thousands of stories. And so it was really wanting to create a visual way to begin to relate to people how many different tribes we have and how many different styles of regalia we have and how each one of those styles of regalia emerge from deep ecosystems, relationship with the ecosystems, with 5 family members spending over a year to make somebody's regalia. These were stories that I was missing when I would go and see a really ugly doll at the truck stop that was supposed to evoke the image of a Native American woman, but it was like pony beads and like felt, right, with bad hair. And so these are meant to like counter all of this and celebrate. And we worked intergenerationally with mothers and their daughters to figure out how we wanted to do the graphic design of the doll boxes. what types of cultural accoutrement would be inside each one of them. Sometimes it's blue corn from grandma's kitchen and the box is painted with pottery, and other times the box was designed with beads and felt to evoke their Choctaw sashes that they wore, and their softgi churns and their pucker-toed moccasins were each chosen by the different women. And so I'm working in Indigenous futurism. This is a celebration, a genre to be celebrated with Native people and other groups of artists as well. It's this idea of coming out of survivance and, recanting, we're still here, and being healthy enough to envision ourselves in the future for the first time. And so these pieces are a celebration of what ideas we might take with us into the future. The chords coming into the women are about how the future will need the knowledge and the hearts and the life-giving abilities of Native women in order to survive. And each one of them has their a piece from each of their own ancestry digitally remastered onto their skin, kind of like, how are we going to take these vernaculars from our tribes into the future? We've taken them through thousands of years to the present. Certainly we'll take them into the future. So a speculative idea about taking our design work into the future. These are shot with green gel, so they're not painted green or blue. They're shot with blue or green light on the person with a balanced daylight on a pink background, and kind of the same idea. This one is called Gikandaso, which in her language means she is knowledgeable, right? And so, we're hearing about the power of traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous science, right? It's going to help us save Western science and land management. It's kind of that idea. And then in her sunglasses, I don't know how well you can tell on this, but she has a reflection of an image of her powwow dances from her homelands that they've danced for hundreds of years up in the woodlands. This one is just kind of fun. It's called The Zenith, and it's got heirloom white corn floating around with my friend George in space. And I wanted to show a little behind the scenes for you about how these come together so you can get an idea of what's photoshopped and what's not. That's always a pretty common question. It's not AI. And so all of the corn is tied up with fishing line in kind of this really fun way. I think that's one of the funnest things about being a photographer is like still being in my 40s and getting to play with my imagination, right? I think it really keeps you young. And so finally, I'm kind of fleshing out a lot of these pieces. I'm going to have my first major solo show, which is really exciting. It's opening in 2025, so I'm working to kind of finish out some of these ideas. This idea of Americana and pop culture, I think it was really born of what we were talking about earlier in people wanting a glimpse into cultural privacy, of photography being used as a weapon against Native people in this way that was, to me, kind of extractive of like, I want pictures of you in your regalia. I want a glimpse into your cultural privacy. It's so exotic. And really came about like talking about how we understand American culture and we understand Western civilization and Western art history. And so it really kind of places us back in a much more normal, much more comfortable conversation with a lot of pointed sense of humor, right? This one is called TV Indians, and it's colored to look like the old sepia photographs, but is a contemporary piece. And then on each of the TV screens, you can see ways that we have been portrayed in American media. So it goes back to the Tonto and Lone Ranger, Dances with Wolves, Little Big Man, Billy Jack are some of the things that are showing up on the screens, the occupation of Alcatraz. And while some of the images are problematic, they're also somewhat beloved in our own community. And I guess when I unpack that in short, I think it's because it's all we had, right? And so we spent a lot of care making sure that these images were beloved on the TVs. And so this idea of the American West, the westward expansion, not really ever being told the impacts to Native American people. These are stories that we hold, you know, about how when the trains came through, it changed everything. It changed our lives from moving from utilitarian pottery making to tourist making, right? And so literally the face of our cultural practices was changed. This idea of Americana tells stories about the Catholic Church coming in and doing horrific injustices to Native peoples in the name of the church. I don't know if you've heard that the doctrine of discovery was just rescinded by the Pope. That was celebrated just last week amongst Native peoples, but the Catholic Church has had a devastating impact on Native peoples, a story that's not told. And finally, this is one of my favorites, but this just brings the character of Coyote into the contemporary times. He's our fabled trickster. You know, these stories that we have, whether they're bird songs or, you know, stories of mythos or oral tradition, they're really telling you stories about how to live, you know, how to be a good person. And Coyote is one of those characters, like he's always shows up and it's a cautionary tale, right? And he always makes the wrong decision, but we love him anyways. So he's our beloved trickster. And this is taken in front of a really iconic place in northern New Mexico, Saints and Sinners. And so you can tell the characters are about to get into trouble or make a bad decision, but we love them anyways. And it's kind of about nightlife and painting the town red, if you will. And so that's my presentation for you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing so much. And now we'd like to turn to conversation. Invite Talia up to the front. Talia will have some questions and conversation with Cara. And then we can open up to all of you.
Take it away.
Okay.
Do we need to wait for mics or can you hear them?
Okay.
We're good.
Okay. Thank you so much. I just am turning to my notes, but I feel a little overwhelmed with all of that right now. But I guess I'll just start by saying how meaningful your work is to me as someone from a tribe in Southern California, the Pama Band of Listeños, and also have Kumeyaay ancestry on my dad's side. So all of your images are, even though regionally, like similar landscapes and cultural like references, and yeah, just seeing Southern California images in this way is like something I had never seen before encountering your work. So it's just been, and especially like in an academic setting, just any depiction is not anything captured by an Indigenous artist, let alone like someone specifically from California. And it's when I was in my undergrad, I was studying dance at the University of Utah, and I was interested in looking at my community's practices and just like anything in the archive. So I encountered a lot of discouraging depictions of Liseño people and in like the anthropological records, and just like the images that are there online are usually just feel really extractive and things that like you don't, should that be out on like in the library database, and like so I just think all that to say your work is intervening in such an important way that's impacted me so personally, and that was kind of where my first, I feel like you already spoke to this a lot, but how you see your work intervening in the way California Native peoples and cultures have been documented in the past, and specifically thinking about the harmful legacy of salvage ethnography and anthropology in California, especially being here at UC Berkeley, and the thinking of the Hearst Museum archives. There's a lot of archives here that are just like physical relatives, but also digital representations of a lot of indigenous communities, but especially like there was a big focus on anthropology down the coast of California.
It's really kind of so mixed, right? Like how painful it is, but how we also kind of need some of those archives as Native peoples also. So it's like kind of a catch-22 when it comes to those. First, the first part of it, I couldn't be more like, will you just pinch me getting to come up here and teach at UC Berkeley? Because it is part of my life now, is I get to go and teach with my photographs. That is not what they tell you when I was your age, right? I was like the black sheep, the disappointment. What are you doing with your life? Going to school for photography. Everything had switched over from film to digital. It was really kind of a painful, but I felt like there was some kind of power in this story. I think I had really gotten past, I don't want to say given up, but I had really gotten past thinking that the body of work would ever take me as far as it did or end up in the classroom. So for me, it's like an incredibly just deep felt good story about getting to make that full circle of wanting to teach cross-culturally about how contemporary we are and how resilient and how much beauty we have, that somebody can see their image, and then at least if I'm like pushing the needle in a way towards like that higher self-esteem, and countering narratives and bringing understanding cross-culturally, I'm sure it's just like this much of what we need. But it's part of the work, and so that's incredibly meaningful for me. I think when I was about 30, I was living at home on the reservation, and in Chemehuevi and Southern Paiutes were known for what's called salt songs, and those are funeral rite songs that we sing for not only the person that has passed to take their spirit to the other side, but also for the bereaved, right? It's a ceremony for the people that are bereaved. And that was the first time I learned about the Phoebe Hearst. We came on the steps and we sang the songs for the people that were still like being retained for, the archaeological study. Because NAGPRO was pretty new and it wasn't making too much traction yet. And so it was kind of a push in that, arts activist way to come and sing and give them ceremony up here on the UC Berkeley campus. as things have been digitized, I guess a good story is that I have sat around in our cultural center and listened to the old recordings that you guys have now digitized of our language speakers, and sat trying to figure out words and things like that. And we do search those archives looking for, you know, sometimes when you're a contemporary Native person, it's like this 1,000 piece puzzle, and you'll never find all the pieces, but you're always like in this search to like put as much of it back together as you can. So I would say that the archives do kind of like hold some puzzle pieces, you know, to when we spend time trying to put the puzzle together. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think, should I ask another question? Yeah, okay. I think the thinking about like Indigenous futurity and the way your work references creation stories, and you bringing the way you also bring life to, or like bringing new life to traditional regalia pieces, and the way those relationships with the natural environment are portrayed through like the kind of maybe like revitalization or like represencing of those like land relationships, like through embodying it in like the clothing. Just thinking about, I guess that was just something that I find really striking, and so sorry. Yeah, just thinking about kind of how like you're taking pieces from the past and bringing them into the future, and kind of like that cyclical nature, and specifically thinking about the regalia.
I think with the futures and pieces, that is one of the things that I was thinking about. I've been watching the genre for a couple of years, and a lot of it was still kind of like pop cultural reference, right? It's hard to get away from that because we've just like grown up with Star Wars and Star Trek and stuff. And so like that kind of defines a lot of our, you know, ideas around futurism. And so when people were blending kind of the Star Wars stuff with traditional stuff, I was like, yeah, but what else, you know? And so I was looking at a lot of people that were working in speculative futurism. And I think one thing that I was able to kind of grasp onto or hold onto is it's like that Indigenous worldview that none of it matters unless we have our heirloom corn, right? So you can kind of like tie it to this importance of Indigenous science, or like how sophisticated, you know, the original sciences of the lands and ecosystem are, you know, and how there's still people caring for that knowledge. But it's not going to matter like how fast the Wi-Fi is, or, you know, what's going on with social media connection if our food systems are collapsing, right? And so I didn't really want to just like focus on technology. That was like kind of why the wires were going into like the important things, you know, is making sure. I've heard the word slow growth culture for Native peoples, and you know, I think that is what it is. I'm not sure if I'm incredibly fond of it, but it is incredibly important, you know, that we carry these things through time. It does, like when you're inseparable and part of the ecosystem, become part of the ecosystem, the stories. That's why these like revitalization of Native languages is so important, because it's all tied to the landscape, right? Which is all tied to the health of the landscape. The arts practices, like, you know, there's a moratorium on abalone now because of the warming of the Pacific waters. And so all of that beautiful regalia we become like the miners' canaries, right? Is what Vine Deloria said. Indigenous peoples are the miners' canaries for the health of the planet, right? And so when we don't have our languages, when you're seeing like not being able to gather, ancestral shells or the things that make regalia, it might not seem like a big thing until you kind of zoom out and realize, that's actual like the beginning of ecosystem collapse. And Native peoples have been living so close to their, arts practices and their languages that they're going to be able to see the very first changes, compared to, when we're talking about, carbon in the atmosphere and the tipping point. Like Native people will tell you, we're already at a tipping point. We could have told you that 10 years ago, and so I thought that was kind of important to include in the artwork. And then just, a celebration of all of the different stories that we have, I think has always been really important. I feel lucky to have gone to tribal college in Santa Fe and been able to work intertribally also. I think there's always a search to kind of get back home and work within my homelands, but for now I get to help tell a lot of stories. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And now we could take questions from the audience, and please raise your hand and there'll be a handheld mic that will come around. Cara, I'll let you.
Yeah.
Go now.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. So earlier in your presentation, you said, I hate using this term, but you know what I'm getting at about the word resources. I know there's several degrees and programs at Berkeley that even have the word resource in the title. I'm pursuing a minor in energy and resources, so it's going to be on my diploma forever. But if I understood what you said correctly, why do you hate using the term resource? Like, what does it perpetuate?
So I feel like this word resources is kind of tied to this idea of commodification of sacred items. And that is really a teaching that comes from our elders and our tribe, that we say special items or sacred things, or, I don't think we've come up with the exact word, but this idea of resources is this idea that Mother Earth is here for the taking, right? And that we're protecting the things that we need instead of more of these ideas of reciprocity. And so I hope that helps answer the question. But this trying to get away from what is owed to us, and this commodification of nature and special items, and more thinking of her as a living, sentient, and all of the precious items that we need to take care of.
Thank you for the presentation, Cara. I'm curious around this use of language. You had talked about sort of photography being used as a weapon for Native people, and thinking about sort of the politics around, pipelines, and how your work is in conversation with this moment, particularly when you're thinking about Keystone, etc. But how can you use photography to sort of subvert yourself in that space as an artist?
That's probably the most difficult part about making the work that I'm trying to make. And I think probably wrapped up in the success, if you will, of, for me, success is like you telling me that it's had a profound effect on you, or you teaching it in the class. It's resonated with a lot of people, and it is about not just creating a piece without thinking, does this give back to my community? Does this have enough content and narrative to explain or communicate some profound thing? And it's hard, right? Like to put words to some of these things. I mean, that's the power of art is you can wrap so many things from consciousness into a piece that it may affect you very different, but shed light on something, whatever you're bringing to the piece, whereas your experience is going to be very different, you know? And so then you begin to have these like even larger effects. I think that that has been something that has surprised me along my journey because it did end up doing all of those things that I wanted to do with it. To me, it may have had a more profound impact in wanting to teach Native studies or, you know, cross-cultural dialogues about contemporary Native issues. And that was not something I was ever told it could do, right? And so I've had this like experience of always making sure that the piece had content and narrative, and then allowed space for, I think a key ingredient is vulnerability, right? I think that the pieces that scare me the most to put out there actually deeply connect with people in a more truthful way. And then layering the content. You know, I don't think a photograph has to be about just one idea. So I will have an idea, and then when I go to make the photograph, I have to remember that art has its own spirit. And so I will try to hold space for the art that wants to happen, if that makes sense. And sometimes it comes out the way I intended, and sometimes I've had to learn that it may not be anything like what I originally intended, but it's great, right? And so there's like jazz, right? There's like a little bit of jazz and like fluidity that has to happen with the piece. But thank you for bringing your experience that it is in conversation with all of those things. Those are deeply important to me. And I think art as activism, artivism, right, is another really important subject because like 4 kids running in front of windmills is far less arming than people arguing on CNN. You know what I mean? And so it's like you can just like go and you can like have this experience with this piece and be like, what is this about, right? You know, they're running away from these wind turbines. They're in indigenous lands. This may be a conversation that you would have never had otherwise, and you can come to your own ideas about it where you don't have people like screaming like, no, we need renewables. You know, it's just like you can have a moment with it, you know? And I love that about art. You know, it's really disarming and a profound way to affect social change, or at least social thoughtfulness. Hi.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for being here today. I've been a huge admirer of your work for a long time, so it's really amazing to have you in the room.
Thank you.
I'm curious about process. You kind of alluded to it a second ago, especially working with other artists as the subjects of your photographs. And I noticed that you both had like folks dressed in their regalia, but also taking like cultural patterns and things from like textiles and pottery and then having them digitized as well. So I'd be curious as to like what the decision-making process in the room as to whether it's going to be something physical or something digital and like what those conversations are like.
So that's a great question. It starts with an interview process with each person. I would say sometimes the ideas are mine, and then I'm looking for a person that suits the subject. And sometimes they're inspired by the person that then is more editorial, right? And we're telling their personal story. You know, it's got some biography in it. If it's the latter, then there is a lot of interview process and collaboration on making the piece. If it's my idea, I think I have what's called, is it repertory, right? Where you have the same like set of theatrical players that I use over and over. And so it's my friends and family, right? And so sometimes they're playing themselves and sometimes they're playing an idea larger than themselves. Starting to work on film, everything had to be done in camera. And so I spent about 5 years in formal training for photography because everything switched over. And I actually did not go for my MFA. I went for a technical degree in, it was a degree in applied science of photography technology. And during those 2.5 years at Oklahoma State, it was one of those, like my whole family was like, what are you doing with your life? You're going to vocational school after you finished up, you know, like 2 arts degrees. And I was like, but there were all these things that I still wanted to learn about the technical side of things. There was like this schism in the industry, like if it wasn't film, it was shit. Right? But everybody that was learning commercial work in 2004, between 2003 and 2006, were using digital. And digital had not come to compete with film yet in the artist's eye, right? It was still, you know, low resolution, pixelated, things like that. But we were learning Photoshop and layout and things like that, and seeing all of the different like liberating things that Photoshop could do in editing. And they seem so different. Like I think one is definitely stigmatized for not being as great as the other, but photographers have been manipulating, you know, raw images since the very beginning, right? Whether it be sandwiching negatives, dodging things out, you know, the list, staging things. At some point, I didn't care what anybody thought, you know, which I think as a Native woman photographer, this is really long-winded, sorry. About 20 years ago, I was an outsider to everything. Museums did not really collect photography. Native Americans were not part of American collections. There were less than 2% of women in any museums across the country. And photography in my own community of Native people was not considered traditional either. So we only have like a couple of shows a year, like Indian Market. You know, I was kind of awkward, right? And so I was still making this artwork truly out of love of the medium and wanting to do it. I was just showing at Indian Market in Santa Fe. All of that to say, maybe when you never think you're gonna make it, there's some true liberation of what you're making. And so I was making it for my own community, right? I was making it for you. I was making it for, and so there was some deep truth that came out in the work. The use of Photoshop and getting away from film was really about being a mom. And I could not run off on a week-long assignment or walk around with my camera all the time or disappear to the dark room. So I had this moment, another existential crisis, where I was like, I'm just gonna build out this digital dark room, you know? And so I bought the nice monitor and I got the dedicated space in my house to make it really fun to go in there with like the music and the vinyl. And my kids slept on the floor while I edited. But the stage theatrical side of the photography also was birthed out of being a mother, a working mom, right? So I had to spend most of my time in my mind thinking about these photographs, right? And how I was gonna do them and sketch them out. And then I would clear the calendar to be able to do that. Post-production is a whole nother side of it. And so that's when some of those critical decisions are made about, you know, was I able to capture it in camera? Is it evoking the story that I want to tell? And then how much I'm gonna commit to that photoshopping. It will never be as good as when it's done in camera. Like, I mean, it is, but there's just something like why I string up all the corn instead of like cutting it out and placing it in there. Like the human eye is keen on light and fall off and differences and that sort of thing. So I like them to be otherworldly. And so when it's gotten to this space where there's like something supernatural is going on, how did she do that? That's like, I've done it, like that's the stopping point.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Tommy. So I do photography too, and I guess my question that I'm interested in is, so sometimes there's like rules and regulations and like legislations that don't allow you to photograph in certain places. Like for example, it'll be like you can't do a photo shoot in Chinatown past the time of like 8 p.m. or something like that. Some very interesting like laws. I guess because of where you have photographed, was there any place that you are really proud of that you executed properly despite like legislation like getting you down or like probably like, peeking their nose into like what you're doing? And then my second question is, what's your favorite photograph that you have done? Although that's probably like picking children.
Yeah. I think that the answer to the first question, and this is really important for Native people, is that outside of like laws and legislation, we have very strict cultural protocol. And so there are times where I would know to never ask, like, can I photograph that? Whether it be like ceremony or, certain things that are just not open to the public. It's not something that I feel inside of me is like good content, because it kind of goes to that idea of like extractive, like what is that gonna do for my community to pull a photograph out? Or what would it do for Chinatown to go take a photograph that they have obviously put a law in place that they don't want that photograph taken? Do you know what I mean? Like that's where you gotta be really careful with photography and come up with a different idea. Like if a cultural group has said we're uncomfortable with this, it's because people have been running around like they're zoo animals. You know what I mean? And so like that is like something that I never want to. People have to have agency over their photograph and their portraiture. And so I think that that's the first part of that question. I hope I answered it well. I don't go anywhere where it's not allowed. And I would never try to. I guess that's kind of it. And I know like a lot of photojournalists and people that are working in a different practice, maybe that's where the question came from, but that's not for me. And then the second part of the question, what is my favorite photograph? I guess I have a handful. Last Indian Market at the Table, that was kind of my first one where I felt like I had captured something important and that was so well received by my community. It was like more a celebration of my own community, loved it. Water Memory, the one underwater, was the first time I ever invested in a major production, and I was scared to do that as a young person. And if somebody could have just told me it was going to end up in the Met, it probably would have made it a little bit of an easier decision. But it was really hard. It was my whole life savings, which was, like $3,000 at the time, and so it's okay. It's okay to invest in yourself. I think when you come from, below socioeconomic median, things like photography and investing in yourself as a Native woman can feel frivolous, but it's actually like a radical act of self-care. And so invest in yourself, invest in your practice, believe in yourself that it's all gonna shake out, especially if that's, your passion. I like Ka a lot, the one with the flying hair, and Evolvers a lot. And Naomi, the hot pink doll box. I like that one a lot. Coyote Tales. Okay, I'll stop.
Well, I think we're at time, and thanks to you all for great questions. So let's thank Cara for really a generous, warm, and incisive introduction to her wonderful work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And let's also thank Talia for superb questions that helped us learn more.
Thank you.
Thank you.